Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer my contribution to this year's budget debate. The budget theme is captioned, "A Fresh Approach to a Good Life in a Green Economy." The theme suggests new innovations, new policies and programs to improve one's way of life. Mr. Speaker, before I do get into the substance of my presentation, allow me to ask through you, sir, what is the Honorable Minister, Ms. Brooms, doing about the young community development officers whose contracts were terminated? Aren't they too disadvantaged? Permit me to, Mr. Speaker, to divert a bit to express sincerest appreciation to the leader of the opposition, Dr. Bart Jagdeo, and the leadership of the People's Progressive Party Civic for granting me this opportunity to represent the people of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, I wish to inform the young member of Parliament from Region Number 10 who spoke earlier today and any other person in this House or outside of this National Assembly that I do have the right to choose which political party I want to associate with, and I have chosen to bear allegiance to this nation under the People's Progressive Party Civic. That is my right. Further, Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind the honorable member that God gave us our freedom and will always respect our freedom to make choices. While we are accountable for our choices, and there will always be consequences for those choices, both good and bad, which may include being in opposition, Mr. Speaker. God fosters the spirit of freedom, and He knows that the human spirit requires freedom to effectively serve, and that is what I am doing here, and serve I will. Mr. Speaker, Budget 2015 comes at a time when Guyanese are expecting the fulfillment of the promises made by the APNU during their elections campaign, and the team offers much hope. Regrettably, Mr. Speaker, the approach being employed by the APNU administration, though it may be fresh because they're new in office, does not meet the aspirations of many of the Guyanese citizens, and I have no doubt that many Guyanese are disappointed and dissatisfied with this budget. Mr. Speaker, I say this premised on the fact that many, if not all Guyanese, were looking forward to the phased reduction of the value-added tax. Investors anticipated tax incentives, particularly those who are desirous of investing in the tourism sector. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, Guyanese are still saddled with the burden of the value-added tax. Taking VAT off of a few items of the government's choice does not offer any relief to Guyanese. Were Guyanese consulted on the items that the APNU government chose to zero rate? How do we know that if they were given a choice, those were the items they would have chosen to be zero rated? All Guyanese, Mr. Speaker, must be consulted on policies that have far-reaching consequences on their lives. That is what happens in any functioning democracy. Any action which seeks to disregard the importance of consultation is a violation of Guyana's constitution. The APNU government will be well advised to desist from their undemocratic practices. The parents and guardians of public school children were very disappointed with the announcement by the APNU administration of discontinuing the disbursement of the $10,000 assistance. But with mass public outcry by parents, they were hoping that the APNU government would be responsive to their concerns and reconsider its position and would have designed a package for their children, which would have compensated for the withdrawal of the $10,000 assistance which the former government was giving to public school children. I was hoping to hear the Honorable Minister, Ms. Blooms, who appears to be the champion of the disadvantaged, Mrs. Blooms, unveil such a program. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, we saw the unresponsive and undemocratic nature of the APNU administration. The question which can be asked and should be answered.
Honourable Member, I must ask us all in this chamber to conduct ourselves in a better manner than we have so far been doing.
No better, Mr. Speaker.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much, sir. The question which can be asked and should be answered by the APNU government is whether ignoring the plight of the poor and the cry of our children, in their view, constitute a fresh approach to the good life. Such an approach certainly does not guarantee a good life. I urge the APNU government to reconsider this approach. Mr. Speaker, those of us who are teachers and who are in constant contact with parents and their children understand and appreciate the extent to which that sum of money contributed to the purchase of exercise books, paste, geometry sets, and other school supplies. It is my submission that that form of assistance should not have been taken away from our children, but it should have been increased, perhaps to $20,000 in light of the rising cost of living. And that is an increase that the PPPC was contemplating. Mr. Speaker, I wish through you, sir, to call on the Minister of Finance and the two Ministers of Education to reconsider the position of the APNU administration and move an amendment to include the $10,000, which our children more than deserve. Let us, by our actions, make a reality of the budget theme, a fresh approach to a good life in a green economy by formulating programs and implementing policies which would address the plight of the poor and the disadvantaged. Mr. Speaker, I wish to turn my attention to tourism. A perusal of the section on tourism creates the impression that nothing was happening in the tourism sector over the last 20-odd years. I wish to refer to page 26, paragraph 1 of the budget presentation, where the Minister of Finance states that, and I quote, "For years, the sector has struggled from a poorly resourced marketing effort, one that has been responsible for sluggish growth in the economy, while the quality of the product offering and the visitors' experience still requires strengthening in many areas," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the Minister of Finance would want Guyanese to believe, I wish to inform the nation that the tourism sector has experienced tremendous growth under the People's Progressive Party Civic, to the extent that in the year 2014, Guyana was referred to as the best kept secret of South America by the National Geographic Traveler magazine, and it was also touted among the 20 destinations to visit in 2014. That list, Mr. Speaker, reflected what is authentic, culturally rich, sustainable, and superlative in the world of travel today. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance could not have been describing this tourism sector that saw tremendous growth under the PPPC. I wish to quote from page 27, paragraph 4.36 of the budget presentation of 2014, and I quote, "In 2013, visitor arrivals totaled 200,122, reflecting a 13.3% increase over 2012, end of quote. that, in my view, speak to a growing tourism sector. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance on page 27 of the budget presentation referred to the establishment of a tourism hospitality school. Mr. Speaker, the establishment of such a school is commendable, but the APNU administration could not have been serious of a fresh approach in the execution of this project. This project was conceptualized by the PPPC, and a proposal was designed which would have seen government spending $800 million to establish a hospitality institute. But, Mr. Speaker, why are we reinventing the wheel, so to speak? If tourism is a priority for this government, the APNU administration needs to be creative. Rather than rely on the PPPC plans, whom they claim did nothing, allow me to remind the APNU administration that Guyana already has the basis for a hospitality school in our well-renowned Carnegie School of Home Economics, which with a little creativity can begin the process of training individuals for our hospitality industry. It is prudent.
Honourable member, you have 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you, sir. It is prudent that we build on what we have. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has recognized that in order for tourism to flourish, a multi-sectoral approach is necessary, as is stated on page 27 of his budget presentation, when he says that, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, for tourism to flourish, a cross-sectoral approach effort is required among governments, private sector, and civil society to ensure a visitor's experience that results in repeat visits and positive stories here and abroad. The PPPC agrees with such an approach, but it is our view that a tourism policy needs to be developed and executed through a multi-sectoral approach, which involves the ministries with portfolio responsibility for public infrastructure, tourism, culture, education, and indigenous affairs. The Minister of Finance during the budget presentation failed to mention a tourism policy. The question which therefore looms large, Mr. Speaker, is what is the policy of the APNU administration that would ensure that tourism acts as an engine for growth through foreign exchange earnings and the creation of direct and indirect employment? So, where is the vision for tourism, for the tourism sector, so that it could play its rightful place in the growth and development of Guyana? Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it is our hope that the APNU administration would formulate a tourist policy to guide all tourism development, operations, and management, so as to meet the government's immediate and long-term objectives for tourism. This policy must be premised on the principles of sustainability and in line with international best practices. Mr. Speaker, it is our submission that the marketing of tourism has to take on a holistic approach, one that comes out of a policy position, as opposed to the ad hoc and piecemeal approach the APNU seems to be employing. Mr. Speaker, another important issue that can be attended to immediately by the APNU administration. When the tourists come out of the Chadijagan International Airport, he or she is confronted by numerous taxi drivers soliciting passengers. If the APNU is going to make a reality of the term a fresh approach, it is incumbent upon them to consider instituting taxi regulations at both the Chadijagan International Airport and the Ogle International Airport. We do appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that the Chadijagan International Airport has an official taxi service whereby taxi drivers can be identified by their official badges and uniforms. However, there is no system in place which ensures that taxi drivers wait their turn, nor is there any means of knowing which taxi a tourist goes into in the event that that tourist goes missing shortly after boarding that taxi. As a means of improving security, the government is urged to consider the possibility of putting in place a taxi dispatch and monitoring system at the airports. Mr. Speaker, another issue of vital importance to building a strong tourist industry in Guyana, and which should be a top priority for the APNU administration, is that of search and rescue. There is the urgent need for the creation of a national search and rescue program. The implementation of this program would serve to prevent the loss of life and injury through search and rescue alerts. This program can be incorporated into the Coast Guard section of the Army and would serve to create employment for pilots, medical personnel. The People's Progressive Party Civic, Mr. Speaker, wishes to urge the Minister of Finance to give urgent consideration to this critical area, not only for the creation of a safe tourist destination, but for the many Guyanese who traverse the interior of our country in order to secure their livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance on page 26 of the budget presentation referred to the fact that, as a result of the most recent marketing review, the APNU administration AFC will be pursuing a policy which will see more tourists coming from South America. This is stated on page 26, and I quote, "It is expected that more visitors will originate from target markets than previously." This is indeed commendable, Mr. Speaker. However, we need to take into account the language barrier that separates Guyana from other South American countries and begin to implement compulsory language courses, starting with frontline staff such as immigration officers, customs officers, and tourist guides. That would certainly, Mr. Speaker, address the question of a fresh approach as we seek to attract tourists from South America. In concluding, Mr. Speaker, I do agree that there is need to improve and enhance the visitor's experience. I therefore anticipate that the Honorable Minister of Tourism will provide details in relation to the fresh approach that the APNU administration will be employing to accomplish its aspirations. The Minister of Finance also mentioned the APNU's administration to at least doubling the tourism marketing budget over the next 5 years. But side by side with that, Mr. Speaker, thank you, sir. But side by side with that, Mr. Speaker, was the need to mention an increase in funding for product development. Mr. Speaker, if the APNU administration has the political will to make a reality of the budget team, I wish to urge them to take on board the recommendations and proposals which emanated from this and which will continue to be emanated from this side of the House, so that all Guyanese can indeed benefit from a good life in a green economy. I thank you.
I thank the honourable member for her statement. The next speaker